The October air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and decaying leaves as Maggie and Tom pulled up to their new home, a towering Victorian mansion, painted in shades of faded gray and deep burgundy. The house stood at the edge of a sprawling forest, its ancient trees swaying gently in the autumn breeze. To them it felt like stepping into a storybook. Maggie couldn't help but admire the detailed craftsmanship of the house as they climbed out of the car. The elaborate woodwork, the wraparound porch, and the turret that loomed over the left side of the house made it a perfect candidate for their dream home. Tom, ever the optimist, had fallen in love with the place the moment he saw it. "Can you believe we got this place so cheap?" he said, running his hand over the chipped but ornate front door. "It's like it was waiting for us." Maggie forced a smile, not wanting to dampen Tom's enthusiasm. There was something about the house that unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way the windows seemed to stare back at her, or the faint chill in the air despite the sun shining overhead. It wasn't just the house, it was the entire area. The locals had acted strangely when they first mentioned they were buying the old Victorian on Ridgewood Lane. Some gave polite smiles and quick congratulations, but others seemed concerned. One older woman had even grabbed Maggie's arm as they left the town's general store, her voice low and strained. "You be careful in that house, dear," she had whispered. "It's not just old, it's wrong." Tom hadn't heard and Maggie didn't tell him. He would have laughed it off as superstitious nonsense. As they carried the last of their boxes inside, the house felt even larger and more ominous on the inside. The grand staircase curved up into shadows, its wooden banisters smooth but worn from years of use. The floors creaked beneath their feet with each step, as if groaning in protest. The smell of dust and old wood hung in the air, making Maggie's nose tingle. Sunlight streamed through the tall, narrow windows, but it wasn't enough to chase away the shadows that clung to the corners. "Needs a bit of work," Tom said cheerfully as he dropped a box of kitchenware onto the marble countertop. "But nothing we can't handle." Maggie nodded absent-mindedly, her eyes drawn to the old study off to the side of the foyer. Its heavy wooden door was cracked open, revealing a room filled with towering bookshelves and a massive, dust-covered desk. There was something about that room that pulled at her, but not in a good way. It felt too quiet, too still. "I think I'll start unpacking upstairs," Maggie said quickly, eager to be away from the study's unsettling presence. Hours passed as they worked through the boxes, sorting through old and new belongings, trying to make the house feel like theirs. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the rooms, Maggie realized just how isolated they were. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the town itself seemed to turn in early. The quiet was oppressive. By nightfall they were both exhausted. Tom had lit a fire in the large stone fireplace in the living room, and they sat together on the couch, basking in the warmth as the flames crackled softly. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the house creak and groan as if it were alive. "This is going to be perfect," Tom said, his voice soft with contentment. "Especially for Halloween." Maggie smiled, but the unease from earlier still gnawed at her. "Didn't it seem strange to you that no one else wanted this house?" "I mean, it's beautiful and the price was practically a steal." Tom shrugged. "Maybe the locals are just superstitious. You know how small towns can be. Old houses always come with stories. Ghosts, murders, curses, it's part of the package." "Still," Maggie said, glancing out the window toward the darkening woods. "It just feels like there's something off here." Tom chuckled and gave her a reassuring kiss on the cheek. "We'll be fine. Besides, it's Halloween season. A little spookiness is part of the charm." As the fire dwindled and the room grew colder, Maggie agreed to let the conversation go. But even as she tried to relax, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. That something ancient and patient, was watching them. Later that night, after they had settled into bed, the house grew deathly quiet. The only sound was the faint rustling of the wind outside. Maggie, exhausted but still on edge, tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. Tom, as always, was already snoring softly beside her. It was in that half-awake, half-dreaming state that she heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper. At first she thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the old windows. But then it came again, clearer this time, a voice too faint to understand but unmistakably there. It seemed to be coming from the walls. Maggie sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. The voice was gone. Silence again. She glanced over at Tom, still fast asleep, oblivious to the strange sound. "Maggie?" The whisper came again, soft but distinct. Her name. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was coming from the wall right next to her head. Slowly she leaned closer, her ear almost touching the cold plaster. There was nothing. No voice. No sound. But as she pulled away, the door to their bedroom creaked open on its own, the hinges squealing like nails on a chalkboard. Maggie stared at the open door, her blood running cold. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As the first day in their new home came to a close, Maggie couldn't shake the nagging feeling of dread that had settled over her. Tom might have laughed off the idea of ghosts and curses, but something was wrong with this house. And deep down, she feared it was only the beginning. The next morning, Maggie awoke to the smell of fresh coffee and the distant sound of Tom humming in the kitchen. Despite the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the bedroom window, she felt groggy, her body heavy with the weight of a sleepless night. The strange whispers and the door creaking open on its own haunted her thoughts, but Tom seemed blissfully unaware of her growing unease. "Morning." Tom greeted her cheerfully as she entered the kitchen. "I thought I'd start the day right with some coffee and pancakes. Big day ahead." Maggie forced a smile as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Big day, huh?" "Yeah, I figured we could really start working on setting up for the party. We've only got a few days until Halloween, and I want this place to be perfect." He gestured around the kitchen. "Maybe some cobwebs here, a few jack-o'-lanterns on the porch, and we can hang the skeletons from the trees. People are going to love it." Maggie nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. The events of the previous night nagged at her, but she didn't want to ruin Tom's excitement. "Sounds good. I'll start with the living room," she said, trying to push the unsettling feelings aside. As she made her way through the house, Maggie couldn't shake the eerie feeling that clung to the air. Every room felt colder than it should, and no matter how many windows she opened, the house retained a strange, musty odor. She decided to start in the study, hoping the day's work would distract her from the strange events of the night before. The study was a relic of the past, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with old, dusty tomes and a massive, intricately carved wooden desk that dominated the center of the room. As Maggie began clearing space for Halloween decorations, her hand brushed against something odd, a loose wooden panel on the wall near one of the bookshelves. Curiosity piqued, she knelt down to examine it. The panel was slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to seal it, but it had come loose over time. Gently, she pried it open, revealing a small, dark compartment behind the wall. Inside, wrapped in a tattered, decaying piece of cloth, was something small and round. Her breath caught as she reached inside and carefully pulled the object out. It was a doll. The doll was old, its porcelain face cracked and yellowed with age. Its glass eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The doll's tiny dress was frayed and stained, but what unsettled Maggie most was its expression, a faint eerie smile that seemed too lifelike, almost mocking. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the doll in her hands. Why had it been hidden in the wall like this? And how long had it been there? She felt a wave of nausea, the doll's wide, glassy eyes reflecting her own uneasy gaze. It looked like it had been locked away for a reason, like something that shouldn't be found. "Maggie?" Tom's voice startled her and she nearly dropped the doll. She quickly wrapped it back in the cloth and stood up, trying to compose herself as Tom entered the room. "Hey, how's it going in here?" Good," she replied, her voice shaky. "I found something weird." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" She unwrapped the doll and showed it to him. It was behind this loose panel in the wall. "I don't know, it feels off." Tom studied the doll for a moment, then laughed. "Are you kidding? This thing is awesome. Look how creepy it is. It's perfect for Halloween." He took the doll from her, inspecting it closely. "It's probably some old antique. We should keep it. Maybe put it on display for the party?" Maggie frowned, unsure. There was something about the doll that made her skin crawl, something that felt wrong. "I don't know, Tom. It gives me the creeps." "Of course it does," he said, grinning. "That's the whole point. It's Halloween. We're supposed to be creeped out." He carried the doll out of the study and placed it on the mantel in the living room, positioning it so that it faced the center of the room. "See? Perfect centerpiece." Maggie couldn't help but shudder. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her as she moved around the room, its cracked smile widening in the flickering afternoon light. "I guess," she muttered, though every fiber of her being wanted to throw it away. But she didn't. She told herself she was being silly, that it was just an old toy, and there was nothing to be afraid of. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Maggie tried to lose herself in the party preparations, hanging cobwebs in the corners of the living room and arranging decorations around the house. But her eyes kept drifting back to the doll. No matter where she was in the room, it seemed like the doll's glassy stare followed her, unblinking and ever-present. That night, as they prepared for bed, Maggie couldn't shake the gnawing sensation in her stomach. She lay awake long after Tom had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling. It's just an old doll, she told herself. It's nothing. But then she heard it again. The same soft, barely audible whisper that had haunted her the night before. This time it was clearer, almost like the faint giggle of a child. Maggie bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. She listened, holding her breath, trying to convince herself that it was just the wind. But the sound came again. The soft, rhythmic patter of tiny footsteps, moving down the hallway. Her eyes widened and she turned to wake Tom, but he was fast asleep, oblivious to the noises. Maggie got out of bed, her feet barely making a sound on the cold wooden floor. She crept toward the hallway, her skin prickling with fear. The hallway was dark, the shadows long and distorted in the dim light. She could feel her pulse thudding in her ears as she moved closer to the living room. And then she saw it. The doll. It wasn't on the mantel where Tom had placed it earlier. It was on the floor, sitting in the middle of the room facing the hallway. Its cracked smile seemed wider than before, its eyes glinting in the darkness. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't scream as the doll sat there, its head slightly tilted, watching her. The house was silent, but the weight of something unseen pressed down on her. After what felt like an eternity, Maggie backed away, her body trembling. She hurried back to the bedroom and closed the door behind her, her heart pounding. She crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, her eyes wide with terror. But the whispers didn't stop. Long after she had retreated, they continued, soft and insistent, filling the empty spaces of the house. And in the silence, as Maggie lay awake in the dark, she could still hear the faint sound of footsteps, moving closer. The following morning, Maggie felt the weight of the sleepless night bearing down on her. Her body ached, her mind clouded with exhaustion and dread. As she sipped her coffee at the kitchen table, her eyes constantly drifted toward the living room, where the doll still sat in its new place on the mantel. It hadn't moved again, at least not that she could tell, but the sense of being watched had lingered, clinging to her like a heavy fog. Tom was already in full party planning mode, oblivious to her growing anxiety. "I'm thinking we should head into town later to pick up a few more things," he said, glancing over a list of supplies. "Some extra candles, maybe a fog machine. Really set the mood for Halloween." Maggie barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the whispers and footsteps she had heard the night before. She knew she hadn't imagined them, but Tom hadn't heard a thing. He had been so sound asleep, completely unaware of the bizarre happenings around them. "Yes, sure," she muttered absently, her eyes still locked on the doll. Tom noticed her distracted state and gave her a playful nudge. "You okay? You've been staring at that thing all morning?" Maggie blinked, snapping out of her thoughts. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just didn't sleep well." "Still creeped out by the doll?" Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "It's just a decoration, Mags. You're letting your imagination run wild." Maggie nodded, forcing a small smile, but the truth was gnawing at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the doll wasn't just an ordinary object. It felt alive in some horrible, quiet way, like it was biding its time, waiting for something. And the fact that it had been hidden behind the wall for who knows how long only made things worse. After breakfast, Tom went to the hardware store while Maggie decided to head into town on her own. The small, quaint village felt like it belonged in a different time, with its cobblestone streets and old-fashioned storefronts. She found herself wandering toward the local library, hoping to dig up some history on the house. Maybe if she could understand where the doll came from, or who it had belonged to, she could ease her mind. The library was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of old paper and dust. A bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the librarian, Mrs. Harker, looked up from her desk with a polite smile. Mrs. Harker was an older woman with thin gray hair pinned into a tight bun and small wire-rimmed glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She had the kind of face that looked as though it had seen much and said little. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Harker greeted, her voice soft but sharp. "How can I help you today?" Maggie hesitated for a moment before speaking. I just moved into the old Victorian on Ridgewood Lane. My husband and I are trying to find out more about its history." At the mention of the house, Mrs. Harker's expression changed. Her smile faltered, and something dark flickered in her eyes, something that sent a shiver down Maggie's spine. "The old house at the end of Ridgewood Lane?" Mrs. Harker's voice was low, almost cautious. "You're living there now?" Maggie nodded. "Yes, we just moved in a few days ago." Mrs. Harker set down the book she had been cataloging and removed her glasses, folding them neatly in her lap. She leaned forward slightly, as if she were about to share a secret she had carried for too long. "That house has a history. Not the kind you want to hear, I imagine." Maggie's heart began to race. She hadn't expected such a direct response, but now that she was here, she needed to know more. What kind of history? Mrs. Harker sighed, her eyes distant as she glanced out the library window toward the town square. The house used to belong to the Thornfield family. They were one of the oldest families in the area, very wealthy and very private. There were rumors, of course. There always are with families like that. But the real tragedy came about 80 years ago. Their daughter Lillian, she disappeared. Maggie felt a chill crawl up her spine. Disappeared? What happened to her? No one knows, Mrs. Harker continued. Lillian was only 6 years old. One morning her parents found her bed empty. The house was searched from top to bottom, but she was never found. There were no signs of a break-in, no ransom note, nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The room seemed to grow colder as Mrs. Harker spoke, the weight of the story settling over Maggie like a thick blanket. She had an unsettling feeling she knew where this was going. And the doll? Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Did it belong to Lillian? Mrs. Harker's expression grew even graver. Yes, Lillian was rarely seen without that doll. After she disappeared, her parents became reclusive, locked away in that house for years. People said they could hear her mother crying late into the night, calling Lillian's name. Eventually the family moved away, but no one ever stayed in the house for long after that. Strange things happened to those who did. Maggie swallowed hard. What kind of strange things? The librarian's voice lowered as if the walls themselves might be listening. Footsteps in the night, whispers through the walls. People saw the doll move. It was always found in different rooms even when no one had touched it. And some claimed to hear Lillian's voice calling out, asking them to come play with her. Maggie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She thought of the footsteps she had heard last night, the soft giggles, and the whispers that had seemed to come from the very walls. Do you think she's still there? Maggie asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Harker didn't answer right away. She looked Maggie squarely in the eyes, her expression grim. I think that house holds on to things that should have been let go a long time ago. Lillian's spirit, if it's still there, might not be at rest. And if you found that doll, then it's possible she's trying to reach out again. Maggie's throat tightened. Reach out for what? To find someone new, Mrs. Harker whispered. To take her place. Maggie felt her stomach drop. She had to get out of there, get away from the oppressive weight of the librarian's words. She stood quickly, murmuring a hasty thank you before rushing out of the library, her pulse racing. The cool air outside hit her like a slap, but it did little to calm the growing fear inside her. As she made her way back to the house, the doll's cracked face and lifelike eyes haunted her thoughts. She could still hear the whispers, still feel the creeping dread that seemed to wrap itself around the very walls of the house. She didn't know if Mrs. Harker's stories were true, but something deep within her told her that the old woman was right. The house held on to things that weren't ready to be forgotten. And now they were reaching out for her. By the time Maggie returned home from the library, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows over the Victorian house. The unease from her conversation with Mrs. Harker lingered, settling in her chest like a heavy stone. She couldn't stop thinking about Lillian Thornfield, the missing little girl, and the doll that had been found behind the wall. The doll that now sat on the mantel, watching over the house with its lifelike eyes. As she stepped through the front door, Maggie found Tom in the living room, hanging strings of fake cobwebs and positioning plastic skeletons in the corners. Halloween decorations cluttered every surface, and the house had been transformed into a haunted wonderland. Tom was in his element, grinning as he adjusted a flickering jack-o'-lantern on the windowsill. Hey, you're back. Tom called, his voice cheerful and oblivious to the tension that gnawed at Maggie. You ready for tomorrow? I picked up some more decorations. The party's going to be amazing. Maggie nodded absently, her eyes drifting to the doll on the mantel. It hadn't moved, not that she could tell, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting for something. After everything she had learned, the idea of throwing a party in this house seemed like the worst possible idea. But Tom was excited and she didn't want to dampen his enthusiasm. Still, she couldn't keep her fears to herself any longer. Tom, she began cautiously, I went to the library today. I talked to the librarian about the house. He barely glanced up from adjusting a bat-shaped decoration. Yeah. Find out anything cool? Maggie took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. The house used to belong to a family called the Thornfields. They had a daughter, Lillian. She disappeared when she was 6 and no one ever found her. Tom paused, finally looking up at her with mild concern. That's weird. What happened? No one knows, Maggie continued, her voice trembling slightly. But the doll, that doll you found and put on the mantel, was hers. The librarian told me people who lived in the house after the Thornfields experienced strange things. They heard whispers, footsteps, and the doll would move on its own. Tom frowned, setting down the fake cobwebs. You're not saying you actually believe all that, right? I mean, it's just a creepy story, probably one that's been passed around for years. Maggie felt a surge of frustration. I don't know what I believe, Tom, but I've heard things. I've felt things. Last night I heard whispers, someone was calling my name. And I heard footsteps, like a child running through the hallway. Tom sighed and crossed the room to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Look, I get it. Moving into a new house, especially one this old and creepy, can mess with your head. I mean, it's Halloween, for crying out loud. We're surrounded by spooky stuff. You're probably just on edge. Maggie wanted to believe him, wanted to dismiss the dread gnawing at her insides as nothing more than her imagination. But she couldn't. She knew something was wrong with the house and with the doll. She could feel it in the very walls. I just think, maybe we should cancel the party, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked at her as if she had suggested burning down the house. What? Maggie, come on. We've spent all this time getting ready, and you know how much I've been looking forward to this. People are already excited about it. Maggie hesitated, her resolve wavering. She didn't want to be the one to ruin everything. Tom had worked so hard to make the party special, and she didn't want to crush his excitement. But as she glanced at the doll again, its eyes glinting in the dim light, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. All right, she said finally, her voice tinged with reluctance. But if anything strange happens tonight, we need to rethink staying here. I mean it. Tom smiled, pulling her into a quick hug. Deal. But I promise nothing weird is going to happen. It's just a party. That evening, the house filled with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and clinking glasses as their guests arrived. People were dressed in costumes, ranging from ghouls and witches to classic monsters. The once eerie and quiet mansion was now alive with activity, and Maggie found herself momentarily distracted from her fear. The decorations, the dim lighting, and the flickering jack-o'-lanterns gave the house a fun, spooky atmosphere, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. But even as she mingled with the guests, her eyes kept drifting back to the doll on the mantel. No one else seemed to notice it, but Maggie couldn't help but feel that its presence was looming over the party like a dark cloud. She had moved it earlier that day, tucking it further back into the shadows of the mantel, hoping to forget about it for the night. But it hadn't helped. She could still feel its cold, unblinking eyes on her. As the party went on, Maggie overheard snippets of conversations that only deepened her anxiety. Some of the guests, locals who had lived in the area for years, were swapping ghost stories about the house. I heard the place is haunted, one man dressed as a vampire said to a group near the kitchen. The last owners couldn't stay more than a few months. They said they kept hearing voices in the walls. Yeah, I remember hearing something about that, another woman added, her witch hat bobbing as she spoke. People say the place is cursed. Every family that's lived here has had some kind of tragedy. Maggie's stomach churned. She wanted to walk away to stop listening, but the more she heard, the more the unease settled deeper into her bones. The hours ticked by, and just as Maggie began to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right, the atmosphere in the house started to shift. The air grew colder, the lively chatter of the guests seemed to quiet, and a strange tension settled over the room. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then the lights flickered. Maggie froze. The laughter died down and people exchanged uneasy glances. Tom, ever the host, chuckled nervously. Must be the wiring in this old place, he said, trying to make light of the situation. But Maggie wasn't so sure. The air felt different, heavy, like the house had suddenly come alive around them. As people resumed talking, trying to laugh off the moment, Maggie's gaze drifted to the mantel. The doll was gone. Her heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening in her ears. She scanned the room, her breath catching in her throat. It had been there just a few minutes ago. She was sure of it. But now the mantel was empty, no trace of the doll in sight. She turned to Tom, her voice urgent. Tom, the doll. It's gone? Tom frowned, following her gaze to the mantel. What do you mean it's gone? I don't know, it was just there. Maggie's voice trembled with panic. It was sitting right there and now it's... Before she could finish, the lights went out completely, plunging the entire house into darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the guests, followed by nervous laughter and the shuffling of feet. Someone fumbled for their phone, the glow of the screen offering a small pool of light. Maggie, Tom said softly, his voice laced with concern. Where is the doll? I don't know, she whispered, her body tense with fear. I don't know. A sudden cold draft swept through the room, and in the darkness, Maggie could hear it. the faint sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and far too small to belong to any of their guests. The sound echoed through the house, growing louder with each passing second. Someone screamed. Maggie's breath hitched as she grabbed Tom's arm, her body frozen in place. The footsteps continued, but now they were accompanied by something else. A voice. Faint at first but growing louder, more distinct. Maggie. The voice was soft, sing-song, like a child calling out from somewhere in the dark. Maggie, come play with me. The whispers returned, swirling around them like a gust of cold wind. The guests began to panic, voices overlapping as people fumbled through the darkness, searching for the front door. But the door wouldn't budge. No one could get out. Maggie's heart raced as she felt the walls closing in around her, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. And through the chaos, through the dark, cold air, she saw it. The doll. Standing in the doorway of the living room, its cracked face illuminated by the faint light of a nearby phone. Its glass eyes gleamed with malice, its grin wider than ever before. Maggie, it whispered again, its voice low and guttural. Come play with me. And then the doll moved. The party had descended into chaos, and Maggie realized with dawning horror that everything Mrs. Harker had said was true. The doll, Lillian's doll, wasn't just an object. It was a conduit for something darker, something far more terrifying. And now it had come for her. The lights were out, and the once lively party had plunged into pure chaos. The doll's haunting voice echoed through the house, and Maggie could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. In the dim light cast from a few scattered phones, the panicked faces of the guests flashed around her, their confusion and fear palpable. Maggie, come play with me. The voice, the childlike eerie whisper, repeated, slithering through the darkness like a cold wind. It felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Tom gripped Maggie's arm tightly, his face now filled with concern. What the hell is going on? He whispered, his voice low as though afraid to speak too loudly. What was that? Where is that doll? I don't know, Tom, Maggie replied, her voice trembling, barely able to get the words out. It was just there, and now it's... She couldn't bring herself to say it. She couldn't bring herself to admit that the doll had moved on its own, that it had somehow found a voice. But in her gut she knew the truth. It wasn't just the doll. It was the house. The house was alive and it had trapped them inside. The sound of footsteps, tiny, deliberate, and impossibly light, echoed once again from the hallway. It wasn't the heavy, clumsy shuffling of the party guests. It was something else, something too small, like a child's soft footsteps. The sound drew closer, closer, as if whoever, or whatever, was moving through the darkened house was making its way toward them. And then, like a terrible thought whispered into her mind, Maggie knew. The doll wasn't waiting for her to find it. It was coming for her. She felt cold terror rise in her throat like bile. We need to get out of here, she whispered to Tom, her voice cracking. Now. I know, Tom said, pulling her closer. Everyone's trying to get the doors open, but they won't budge. I don't understand it. They were fine earlier. Maggie's eyes darted around the room, her breath shallow as the crowd of guests began to push toward the front door, jostling and shouting. Several people were throwing their weight against the heavy wooden door, but it held firm like it had been sealed from the outside. The air in the house grew colder, thick with a presence Maggie couldn't describe. It felt as though the house itself was watching them, like it was breathing. And in the shadows, where the flickering light from phones didn't reach, Maggie could swear she saw movement, small shapes darting just out of sight. The whispers grew louder. Come play with me. A sudden scream pierced the air. The guests near the front of the house turned in horror as one of the partygoers, a woman dressed as a witch, collapsed to the ground. Her face was twisted in a mask of pure terror, her eyes wide and unseeing. She wasn't moving. Panic surged through the crowd and several people rushed toward her, trying to revive her. But Maggie's eyes were fixed on something else. The doll. It was standing in the doorway of the hallway, its glass eyes glinting in the low light, its cracked face smiling. But worse than that, it was moving. It took slow, deliberate steps toward them, its tiny porcelain feet tapping on the hardwood floor. The way it moved was wrong, unnatural, as if something invisible was dragging it along, jerking it from place to place like a puppet on strings. Maggie backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't obey. All she could do was stare in paralyzing horror as the doll drew closer. Maggie, come play with me. The voice was louder now, clearer. It was no longer just a whisper. It was demanding, angry. The doll stopped in the center of the room, standing motionless as the air grew colder and the whispers filled every corner of the house. Tom grabbed Maggie's hand, pulling her toward the back of the house. "We need to find another way out. The front door's blocked, but maybe there's a window we can break. Come on." Maggie snapped out of her terror, nodding, and they pushed through the crowd of confused, terrified guests. The whispers followed them as they moved toward the kitchen, where a large window overlooked the backyard. Tom grabbed a chair and swung it toward the window with all his strength. The glass shattered, sending shards flying everywhere, but before anyone could even attempt to climb through, something unimaginable happened. The broken glass began to reform. Piece by piece, the shards floated back into place as if time itself was rewinding. The window was whole again within seconds, the only evidence of Tom's attempt at escape being the glass that still littered the floor. The guests screamed, backing away from the now impossible window, their confusion turning to full-blown panic. Maggie's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The house wouldn't let them leave. It was playing with them, like a child plays with toys. "Tom," Maggie gasped, her voice shaking. "We're trapped." Tom stared at the window, disbelief etched on his face. That's not possible. How is that even possible?" "I told you," Maggie said, her voice rising in desperation. "Something is wrong with this house. We're not alone. The doll. Lillian, she's still here." Tom turned toward her, his face pale. "Lillian?" Maggie nodded, fighting back tears. "The girl who disappeared. Mrs. Harker told me about her, about the doll. It's her. It has to be." The whispers returned, louder this time. And then the soft footsteps again. But now they were everywhere, coming from every corner of the house, from behind the walls, from the ceiling, as though the very structure of the home was crawling with unseen things. "Come play with me." It was coming from the basement. Tom's eyes widened as he realized it too. The basement door, which had been closed all evening, was now slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the kitchen. "We can't go down there," Maggie said, her voice trembling. But before Tom could respond, something else happened. A loud crash from the living room. People screamed again, and Maggie knew something was terribly wrong. She turned and ran back into the living room, her stomach twisting in fear. The doll was gone. In its place, standing in the middle of the room, was something far worse. A figure, small and shadowy, barely the size of a child, stood where the doll had been. Its shape was indistinct, but its eyes, glowing, cold and empty, stared directly at Maggie. The whispers turned into low, guttural growls, reverberating through the walls. Maggie felt the air leave her lungs. The doll wasn't just a toy. It had been a vessel. And whatever had been trapped inside it was free now. "Maggie," the voice growled, deep and distorted. "Come play?" The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, Maggie felt it, the cold, bony hand of something brush against her arm. The house had come alive. The doll, the whispers, the footsteps, everything that had been hidden in the walls for decades had finally surfaced, and it wanted her. As Maggie stared into the growing shadows, her breath coming in ragged bursts, she realized the truth. They weren't just trapped. They were being hunted. The cold, bony touch on Maggie's arm sent an electric shock of terror surging through her body. She recoiled instinctively, stumbling backward into Tom, who caught her just before she fell. Her heart was pounding in her ears, drowning out the sounds of the panicked partygoers as they screamed and struggled to find a way out of the house. The darkness around them was suffocating, thick with the oppressive presence of whatever had been released from the doll. The whispers swirled all around them now, growing louder and more persistent. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, dozens, perhaps hundreds, layered over one another like a chorus of the damned. The voices seemed to be speaking in a language Maggie couldn't understand, their words fragmented and distorted, echoing through the house like a storm. "Maggie, come play, forever?" Tom's grip on her arm tightened. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here. Now." Maggie nodded, but the sheer terror of the situation had paralyzed her. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All she could hear were the voices, and all she could see were the glowing, malevolent eyes of the shadowy figure in the living room. It hadn't moved, but its presence was enough to fill the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was waiting, waiting for something. Waiting for her. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it had claimed them all. "We need to find another way out," Tom urged, his voice trembling. "There's got to be another window, another door, something." But Maggie knew that wasn't true. The house had already shown them what it could do. It had sealed them inside, trapping them like animals in a cage. And the longer they stayed, the stronger the presence within the house seemed to grow. The whispers were feeding off their fear, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. "Maggie?" The voice was clearer now, more direct. It was calling to her, only her. The other voices, the whispers, were background noise, but this voice, this thing, wanted her. Suddenly, the crowd of guests surged toward the kitchen, where someone had managed to pry open the basement door. In the chaos, people were shouting, pushing, and shoving, desperate to escape the horror unfolding around them. The basement seemed to be the only option left. Tom grabbed Maggie's hand and pulled her toward the door, but she hesitated, her body stiff with fear. "We can't go down there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't think it's safe." Tom turned to her, his eyes wide with desperation. "It's safer than staying up here with that thing?" He nodded toward the living room where the shadowy figure stood, still watching, still waiting. Maggie swallowed hard, knowing he was right. They had no choice. Whatever was happening, whatever the house wanted, it wasn't going to stop until it had them. If they stayed, they were dead. Without another word, they pushed through the terrified crowd of guests and descended into the dark, narrow staircase leading to the basement. The steps creaked beneath their feet, and the air grew colder with every step. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more urgent, as if the house knew they were trying to escape. The basement was pitch black, save for the dim beams of light from a few phones. The guests huddled together, their faces pale and wide-eyed as they scanned the room for any sign of danger. But the basement was eerily still, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of the house groaning and shifting above them. Maggie's breath came in shallow gasps as she looked around. The basement was filled with old, forgotten furniture covered in dusty sheets, broken wooden crates, and rusty tools. The room was huge, sprawling beneath the house like a maze of shadows. It was colder down here, colder than it had any right to be, and the smell of mildew and decay was almost overwhelming. "We need to find another exit," Tom said, scanning the room. "There has to be a door or a window down here." But Maggie wasn't listening. Her eyes were drawn to the far corner of the basement, where something glinted in the faint light. It was small, round, and porcelain. Her blood ran cold as she realized what it was. The doll. It was sitting upright on an old, rotting chair, its glass eyes staring straight at her, its cracked smile wider than before. How had it gotten down here? They had left it upstairs, hadn't they? The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through her, and she took a step back, bumping into Tom. "Tom," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The doll. It's down here." Tom's head snapped toward the corner of the room, and his face drained of color when he saw it. "What the, how?" The doll's head tilted slightly as if acknowledging them. Its glass eyes shimmered in the darkness, reflecting the faint light like twin orbs of malice. And then, slowly, it began to move. At first, it was subtle, a small twitch of its head, a slight shift in its posture. But then it rose from the chair. Its limbs jerked and twisted unnaturally, as though something invisible was manipulating it like a puppet. It stood on its tiny porcelain feet, its movements erratic and jerky but unmistakably deliberate. The whispers surged, louder now, almost deafening. The voices surrounded them, filling the basement with a cacophony of sound that made Maggie's head spin. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could hear were the voices. "Maggie, come play, forever." Tom grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the doll, but it was too late. The basement door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. The guests screamed, some pounding on the door, others collapsing in fear. The air grew colder, so cold that Maggie could see her breath in the dim light. And then the doll spoke. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice no longer the soft, childlike tone they had heard before. It was deeper now, distorted, like something ancient and malevolent was speaking through it. "You belong to the house now." The lights on the phones flickered and died, plunging the basement into total darkness. The whispers were everywhere, closing in on them, suffocating them. Maggie could feel them crawling under her skin, seeping into her mind. She clutched Tom's hand, her nails digging into his skin. "We have to get out of here. Now." Tom nodded, his face pale and slick with sweat. "There's got to be another way. We just have to." Before he could finish, a loud crack echoed through the basement. The sound of wood splitting, followed by the heavy groan of something massive shifting above them. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and the walls seemed to tremble. The house was coming apart. The whispers intensified, and Maggie could feel them pressing against her mind, trying to break through, trying to consume her. She stumbled backward, her vision blurring as the pressure in her head grew unbearable. And then, in the darkness, she saw it. A figure, small, childlike, moving toward her. It wasn't the doll anymore. It was Lillian. Her pale, ghostly form flickered in and out of view, her long, dark hair hanging limply around her face, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and her hands reached out toward Maggie. "Come play with me," Lillian whispered, her voice no longer soft and innocent. It was a twisted, guttural sound filled with malice. "Come play, forever?" Maggie's body seized with terror as Lillian's cold, ghostly hand brushed against her skin. The touch was freezing like death itself. "No," Maggie screamed, stumbling backward, pulling Tom with her. "Stay away." The figure of Lillian flickered and dissolved into the shadows, but the whispers remained louder than ever. "We have to move," Tom said, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here before—" The ground beneath their feet trembled again, and the walls began to crack, splitting open as though the house itself was coming alive. Maggie's eyes darted around the room, her mind racing. There was no way out. The house had them. It wasn't going to let them leave. The whispers were part of the house, part of the thing that lived inside it, the thing that had been waiting for them all along. And now it wanted her. With one final surge of strength, Maggie grabbed Tom's hand and ran, not toward the door but deeper into the basement, hoping, praying for a miracle. But deep down she knew. The house was alive, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed her. As they plunged into the dark, twisting corridors of the basement, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. The house was hungry, and Maggie was running out of time. Maggie and Tom ran through the dark, winding corridors of the basement, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on them from all sides. The cold air bit at their skin, and the whispers pursued them like a relentless tide, filling every corner of their minds. Their footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness of the basement, but there was something else following them too, something they couldn't see but could feel with every bone in their bodies. Maggie's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how long they had been running. Time felt twisted in the darkness. Every corner they turned felt like they were only getting deeper into the house's belly, trapped in its maze-like structure. It was as though the walls themselves were shifting, changing, trying to confuse them, lead them further away from any possible exit. "We can't keep running like this," Tom gasped, pulling her to a stop in a narrow passageway. "We need to find a way out or we're going to—" A loud, creaking noise echoed through the basement, interrupting him. It was a deep, mournful groan, like the very foundation of the house was shifting. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and Maggie felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. "We're not getting out," she whispered, her voice hollow. "The house won't let us." Tom's face was pale, his expression stricken with fear, but he refused to give in. "There has to be a way. We just have to." Before he could finish, Maggie's attention was drawn to something strange. A faint light flickering from beneath a door at the far end of the corridor. It was an old, decrepit wooden door, half hidden behind a stack of rotting crates, as if it had been deliberately concealed. The light was faint, barely more than a dim glow, but it stood out in the suffocating darkness like a beacon. "What is that?" Maggie muttered, narrowing her eyes. Tom followed her gaze, frowning. "I don't know. Maybe another part of the basement?" Maggie's heart raced as she stepped toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to stop. But something about the light, something about the door itself, compelled her to move forward. It felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain, as if she had been drawn here, led by the house itself. "Maggie, wait," Tom called after her, his voice laced with hesitation. "What are you doing?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But I think this is where we're supposed to go." Tom hesitated for a moment, then followed her as she reached the door. The wood was old, warped, and splintered with age. It looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. Maggie hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling as she reached for the rusted handle. As soon as her fingers touched the door, the whispers intensified. "Maggie?" The voice was louder now, echoing from the depths of the basement, but somehow also from behind the door. She could feel the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting so fast that her breath turned to mist in front of her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. Something beyond her control was compelling her to open that door. "Maggie, maybe we shouldn't," Tom began, but it was too late. Maggie had already turned the handle. The door creaked open with an agonizingly slow groan, revealing a small room bathed in a dim, flickering light. The air that wafted out was thick with decay and the smell of something rotten. Maggie took a hesitant step inside, her stomach churning as the light flickered from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, shifting shadows over the room. The walls were lined with shelves, and on every shelf, arranged in neat rows, were porcelain dolls. Each one had a cracked face, their eyes dull and lifeless. Some were missing limbs, others had broken fingers or chipped torsos, but all of them wore the same frozen, eerie smile. The room was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint hum of the flickering bulb. "Oh my God," Tom whispered, his voice filled with horror as he stepped in behind her. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she looked around. The dolls stared back at her, their glassy eyes following her every movement. She could feel the weight of their stares, could almost hear the soft, mocking giggles echoing in the back of her mind. But there was something else in the room. Something far worse. In the center of the room, on a small pedestal, sat the doll. Lillian's doll. Its once pristine dress was now dirty and torn, its porcelain face cracked but somehow more vivid, more alive than ever. Its eyes were wide, gleaming with a malevolent intelligence, and its smile was no longer just eerie. It was twisted, gleeful, as though it had finally caught its prey. Maggie felt a wave of nausea roll through her as she stepped closer. Her body moved on its own, as if pulled by an invisible force. The doll seemed to draw her in, its glassy eyes locking onto hers, freezing her in place. And then, from the shadows of the room, a soft giggle echoed. Maggie's blood ran cold. It wasn't just the doll anymore. A figure moved in the corner of the room, small, pale, and ghostly. It was the shape of a little girl, her long dark hair hanging limply over her face. Her skin was translucent, her eyes wide and hollow, and her white nightgown was stained with dirt and something darker, something that looked like dried blood. Lillian. The ghostly figure of the little girl took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound as she moved across the floor. Her head tilted to one side, and her empty eyes fixed on Maggie. The room seemed to grow colder still, the very air freezing in Maggie's lungs. "Maggie," the girl whispered, her voice soft but filled with a malevolent glee. "Come play with me." Maggie's legs refused to move. Her mind screamed at her to run, but she was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped her body. The ghost of Lillian moved closer, her smile widening, her small hands outstretched. Tom stepped in front of Maggie, breaking the spell. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice shaking with fear but filled with determination. Lillian's ghost stopped, her expression twisting into one of confusion. She tilted her head to the other side, studying Tom as if he were some kind of obstacle. The air grew heavier, and the shadows in the room seemed to thicken, swirling around the little girl like a dark fog. And then Lillian spoke again, her voice low and filled with menace. "You're not who I want." Before Tom could react, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing them inside. The dolls on the shelves began to rattle, their glass eyes flickering with life as they slowly turned their heads toward Maggie and Tom, their cracked faces twisting into grotesque smiles. "Maggie," the whispers began again, louder this time, more insistent. "You belong to us now." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, her body trembling as she tried to force herself to move, to think. The room was closing in on them. The dolls were watching, waiting. And Lillian wasn't going to let them leave. Tom grabbed Maggie's arm, his face pale with terror. "We need to find a way out, now." Maggie's eyes darted around the room, but there was no way out. The door was sealed, the walls solid. They were trapped. "No," Maggie whispered, her voice breaking. "We can't." The ghost of Lillian stepped closer, her hand outstretched, her fingers brushing against Maggie's arm. Her touch was freezing, like ice seeping into her skin. "Come play," Lillian whispered, her voice a dark, mocking lullaby. Maggie felt her body grow numb, the cold spreading through her limbs, freezing her in place. She was slipping away, being pulled into the darkness, into the grasp of the house, of the dolls, of Lillian. And in that moment she realized the horrible truth. The house didn't just want to keep them. It wanted to consume them. Lillian's voice grew louder, the whispers blending together in a cacophony of sound that threatened to drown Maggie's mind. The dolls began to move, their tiny porcelain bodies shifting, their glassy eyes gleaming with hunger. "Maggie, forever." In a surge of panic, Maggie wrenched herself free from Lillian's icy grip and stumbled back into Tom's arms. The room was collapsing in on them, the walls closing in, the whispers suffocating them. And in the center of it all, the doll, Lillian's doll, sat on its pedestal, its wide grin growing impossibly large as if it was feeding on their fear. Tom's voice was a low growl of determination. "We're getting out of here." Maggie nodded, her teeth chattering from the cold. They had to find a way out, any way out, before the house claimed them both. But as the shadows swirled around them and Lillian's ghost loomed closer, Maggie realized that escaping might not be possible. Because once the house had its grip on you, it never let go. The walls seemed to pulse with life as Maggie and Tom stood frozen in the small, dimly lit room, the air heavy with an oppressive weight. The porcelain dolls rattled on their shelves, their cracked faces twisted into grotesque grins. The whispering voices swirled around them, growing louder, more insistent, as though the house itself was breathing, its dark tendrils weaving tighter around their minds. "Maggie, Forever? Lillian's ghost hovered just inches from Maggie, her translucent form flickering in and out of sight, her empty eyes gleaming with a sickening hunger. Her hand reached out again, that cold, icy touch grazing Maggie's arm. It was like death itself was trying to pull her under. Tom tightened his grip on Maggie's arm and pulled her away, his voice hoarse with desperation. "We have to get out of here. We're not safe. We need to." Before he could finish, the lights flickered again, and the room was plunged into darkness. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The rattling dolls stopped and the whispers faded. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then suddenly a blood-curdling scream echoed from upstairs. Maggie's heart lurched in her chest. That scream? One of the guests? They weren't alone. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. There were still people upstairs, trapped in the house with them, and something terrible was happening. Whatever had taken hold of the house wasn't just after them. It was hunting everyone. Tom cursed under his breath, his eyes wide with fear. The others? "Maggie, we need to help them." Maggie's mind was reeling, torn between the instinct to flee and the desperate need to save the others. Her stomach twisted with fear, but she knew he was right. They couldn't just leave everyone behind. She nodded, her body trembling as she turned toward the door. But the door was no longer there. Instead of the old, splintered wooden door they had entered through, there was now a solid wall, covered in the same decaying wallpaper as the rest of the basement. It was as if the house had swallowed the door whole, sealing them inside. "We're trapped," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Tom rushed to the wall where the door had been and pounded on it, his fists slamming against the wood. No, this can't be happening. But the wall didn't budge. The house was alive and it was keeping them here. The whispers returned, louder now, more frenzied. Maggie could feel them crawling under her skin, wrapping around her like invisible chains. Her thoughts were clouded with fear and confusion, and all she could think about was how Lillian's ghost had looked at her, like she was the key to something dark. Just then the lights flickered back on, and the room was bathed in a dim, sickly yellow glow. But the room wasn't the same. The shelves of dolls were gone. The walls were bare, stripped of their grotesque decorations, and the small, cramped room now stretched outward into a vast, cavernous space. Maggie blinked in confusion, her head spinning. The room seemed to expand endlessly, stretching far beyond the confines of the house. It was as though reality itself had twisted, warping into something unfamiliar and nightmarish. What is this?" Tom breathed, stepping back, his voice filled with horror. Maggie's heart raced as she looked around, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't a basement anymore. It was something else, something wrong. The walls were pulsing with a faint, rhythmic beat, like the steady thrum of a heartbeat. And the floor beneath their feet felt soft, almost like skin. "We need to go," Maggie whispered, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here." Tom nodded, and together they began moving forward, stepping cautiously through the strange, pulsating room. The air was thick and every breath felt like a struggle. The whispers followed them, growing louder with every step, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. As they moved further into the room, the walls seemed to close in around them, shifting, bending. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping one another in a cacophony of voices that made Maggie's head spin. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a shadow darting across the far end of the room. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow was small, barely more than a flicker, but it was there. Moving. Watching. "Did you see that?" Maggie whispered, her voice trembling. Tom turned, his eyes scanning the room. "See what?" "There." Maggie pointed, her finger trembling as she gestured toward the far corner. But the shadow was gone. Before she could say anything else, a loud thud echoed through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving, a slow, deliberate dragging sound. Maggie's stomach turned with dread as the noise grew louder, closer. And then they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, a guest from the party, one of the women who had been laughing and drinking earlier. But something was horribly wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy, and her body moved in jerky, unnatural motions. It was as though something invisible was pulling her along, dragging her forward like a puppet on strings. "Oh my God," Maggie gasped, covering her mouth. "What's wrong with her?" The woman's head twitched violently to the side, her mouth hanging open as a low, guttural moan escaped her lips. Her eyes were empty, devoid of any recognition or life. She was being controlled, manipulated by something dark, something that was using her like a puppet. Tom stepped back, his face pale with horror. "We need to get out of here. Now." They turned to run, but before they could take another step, the basement walls began to shift again. The ceiling groaned and cracked, and a heavy, suffocating pressure filled the air. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if they were alive. "Maggie, forever," the voice returned, louder now, more insistent. Maggie turned toward the sound, her body frozen with fear. From the far end of the room, another figure emerged, a small, childlike figure, her pale face glowing faintly in the dim light. Lillian. The ghostly figure of the little girl moved toward them, her bare feet silent against the floor. Her long, dark hair hung over her face, and her empty, hollow eyes stared at Maggie with a terrifying intensity. Lillian's mouth twisted into a smile, but it was a smile filled with malice, with hunger. "Maggie," Lillian whispered, her voice filled with a dark, mocking glee. "Come play?" Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, her body trembling. She knew in that moment what the house wanted. It wasn't just Lillian. The house itself was feeding off the souls of the people inside, consuming them, trapping them in its walls, turning them into something else. It wanted Maggie to stay, to become one of them. "No," Maggie whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not staying." Lillian's smile widened, her hollow eyes gleaming. "You don't have a choice." Suddenly the walls shifted again and a sharp, piercing scream echoed through the basement. Another guest, a man dressed as a vampire, came stumbling out of the darkness, his face contorted in terror. His clothes were torn and blood dripped from his arms as he scrambled toward them. "Help me," he screamed, his voice filled with desperation. "Please someone, help." Before Maggie could react, the man's body was yanked backward, pulled by an unseen force. He screamed again, but his voice was cut short as his body disappeared into the shadows, vanishing completely. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. The house wasn't just trapping them, it was devouring them. "Maggie," Tom said, his voice shaking. "We have to keep moving." She nodded, her legs trembling beneath her as they continued deeper into the twisting, nightmarish labyrinth of the basement. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The house was hungry, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed them all. But Maggie wasn't going to let it. Not without a fight. As they moved deeper into the darkness, Maggie's mind raced with a single, burning thought. There has to be a way out. There has to be. But as the shadows closed in and Lillian's ghost followed them, her malicious whispers filling the air, Maggie couldn't help but wonder if they were already too late. The house had claimed others. And now it wanted her. The walls pressed in on them as Maggie and Tom staggered deeper into the maze-like basement, their breaths ragged and heavy. Every creak, every shifting shadow felt like a new threat, a new terror waiting to claim them. The air was thick with the whispers, rising and falling like a chorus of malevolent voices, urging them deeper into the heart of the house's darkness. "Maggie," Lillian's voice echoed, soft but cruel. "You can't leave?" The temperature had dropped even further, and Maggie could barely feel her hands as she clung to Tom, her legs weak from fear and exhaustion. Her mind was spinning with the horrific realization that they were being hunted, not just by Lillian but by the house itself. The whispers weren't just in the walls, they were in her head, crawling under her skin. As they moved through another narrow passage, the basement seemed to shift again, the walls rippling as if they were alive, breathing. Tom stopped abruptly, pulling Maggie to a halt beside him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with dread as he stared ahead. "What is it?" Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom didn't answer at first. He pointed ahead, his hand shaking. "Look." Maggie followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. At the end of the passageway was a door, a tall, heavy, ancient-looking door made of dark wood and iron. It was covered in deep scratches and the doorknob was tarnished with age. But what sent a chill through Maggie's bones was the faint, glowing light that seeped out from underneath it. A sickly, pulsating light that seemed to beckon them forward. "We've got to try," Tom said, his voice strained. "It might be a way out." Maggie's instincts screamed at her to stay away from that door. There was something wrong about it, something evil. But they were out of options. The house was closing in on them, and staying in the maze-like basement was a death sentence. "Okay," Maggie whispered, swallowing her fear. "Let's go." They approached the door cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the strange, fleshy floor beneath them. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as they neared the door. The glowing light intensified, casting eerie, shifting shadows along the walls. It wasn't the warm glow of an escape, it was cold, almost unnatural. Tom reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. He hesitated for a moment, then turned it slowly. The door creaked open with a long, low groan, revealing a room beyond. What lay beyond the door was not what they expected. The room was large, far larger than it should have been for the basement of the house. The walls were made of rough, ancient stone, and the floor was covered in strange symbols, intricate, swirling patterns that glowed with the same eerie light they had seen beneath the door. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something foul like decay. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar. On it lay a crumbling, ancient book, its pages open to a page covered in dark, runic symbols. Around the altar were scattered remnants of old, rotting furniture, torn tapestries, and other strange artifacts that looked like they had been abandoned for centuries. And standing beside the altar was Lillian. Her ghostly figure flickered in and out of sight, her dark hair hanging limply over her face. Her eyes, those wide, hollow eyes, were locked on Maggie. But there was something different now, something more malevolent. Her smile had grown wider, and her small, translucent hands were stained with something dark, dripping onto the floor. "You've come to play with me," Lillian said softly, her voice filled with twisted joy. Maggie's entire body seized with terror. Tom gripped her arm tightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maggie, we need to get out of here." But Maggie couldn't move. Her legs felt rooted to the spot, her mind racing as she took in the horrific scene before her. The room wasn't just part of the basement. It was something else entirely, something far older, far darker. And Lillian, she wasn't just a ghost. She was part of whatever had been bound here, whatever ancient evil had seeped into the walls of the house. "I'm not Lillian anymore," the ghost whispered, stepping toward them, her face twisted into something grotesque, her eyes narrowing into dark slits. "I haven't been Lillian for a very long time," Maggie gasped, stepping back instinctively. "What do you mean?" The smile on Lillian's face grew wider, her voice dripping with malice. "This house, it needs someone. Someone to feed it, to keep it alive. Lillian was just the first. But now it's your turn." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as the truth hit her like a sledgehammer. The house wasn't just haunted by Lillian's spirit. It had consumed her, twisted her into something monstrous. It wasn't just Lillian's ghost keeping them here, it was the house itself, a dark, malevolent force that had been feeding off the souls of its victims for decades, maybe centuries. And now it had chosen Maggie. "No," Maggie cried, shaking her head as she backed away from the ghostly figure. "I'm not staying here. You can't have me." But Lillian, the thing that had once been Lillian, only laughed, her voice echoing through the room like a sinister melody. "You don't have a choice. The house needs you, Maggie. It needs you to stay. Forever." The room began to shift around them, the walls trembling as the ancient symbols on the floor glowed brighter. The air grew thick, oppressive, and Maggie could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, as if the very walls were closing in. "We've got to stop this," Tom said, his voice tense with fear but resolute. "There has to be a way to break whatever this is, some way to end it." Maggie's mind raced. The house had been feeding on souls, trapping its victims and turning them into something twisted and monstrous. If they didn't stop it, she would become just like Lillian, a puppet of the house trapped forever in its clutches. Her eyes landed on the ancient book on the altar, its runic symbols glowing faintly in the flickering light. There was something about it, something that felt important, like it was the key to everything. "Tom," Maggie whispered, her voice shaking. "That book, it's part of this. I think it's what's keeping the house alive." Tom followed her gaze to the altar, his eyes narrowing. "You think if we destroy it we can stop this?" "I don't know," Maggie admitted, her voice trembling. "But it's the only chance we have." Without another word, Tom rushed toward the altar. Lillian, or whatever dark force was controlling her, let out a shriek of rage, her ghostly form flickering violently as she lunged toward him. "No," she screamed, her voice distorting into something inhuman. "You can't. The house needs me. It needs you." Tom reached the altar just as Lillian's ghostly form reached for him, her icy, translucent fingers brushing against his arm. He grabbed the ancient book and, with a primal scream, threw it to the ground, sending the pages scattering across the stone floor. Instantly, the symbols on the ground began to dim, their glow fading. The air around them shifted, and the oppressive weight that had been suffocating them lifted just slightly. But Lillian's ghost didn't disappear. Instead, she let out a piercing scream that rattled the walls. "No," she howled, her face contorting with fury. "You can't stop it. The house will have you." The walls of the room began to tremble violently, cracks forming in the stone as pieces of the ceiling began to crumble. The house was reacting, fighting back, trying to hold on to its power. "Maggie," Tom shouted, grabbing her hand. "We need to get out of here, now." Maggie nodded, her heart pounding as they sprinted toward the door. The house groaned and shuddered around them as though it were alive, as though it knew its grip was slipping. The walls seemed to warp and twist, the shadows growing longer, reaching for them. But as they neared the door, Maggie felt something cold latch onto her ankle. She screamed, looking down to see a shadowy hand, a hand that had emerged from the cracks in the floor. It was pulling her back, dragging her toward the center of the room. "Maggie?" Tom cried, rushing to her side, grabbing her arm and pulling with all his strength. "Don't let go." The hand was strong, impossibly strong, but Maggie fought against it with everything she had, kicking and clawing, her body thrashing as she tried to break free. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming in her ears. And then, with a final burst of strength, she broke free, stumbling into Tom's arms. Together, they ran, sprinting through the collapsing room and back into the twisting halls of the basement. Behind them, the house groaned in fury, its walls shuddering as cracks spread through the stone, but they didn't stop. They didn't look back. All Maggie could think about was escape before the house claimed her. But as they fled, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't done with them yet. Not by a long shot. Maggie and Tom sprinted through the twisting corridors of the basement, the walls shuddering as the house groaned in fury behind them. The air was thick with dust and debris, and the stone floors beneath their feet seemed to ripple as the house's grip faltered. The ancient evil that had bound them to the house was unraveling, but Maggie could still feel it, a malignant presence seething in the shadows, unwilling to let them go. The whispers had become screams now, violent and desperate, as if the house was fighting against its own demise. The floor trembled beneath them, cracks spreading through the walls, but Maggie and Tom didn't stop. They couldn't. They knew the house would stop at nothing to claim them. "Maggie?" Tom called over the roaring noise of the collapsing house. "We're almost there. We just need to find the stairs." Maggie nodded, but fear still gnawed at her. She could feel the house pulling at her, tugging at her mind, whispering dark promises in her ear. The cold touch of Lillian's ghost still lingered on her skin, and she knew that the evil within the house wasn't going to give up easily. As they rounded another corner, Maggie spotted the stairwell leading up to the main floor. Relief flooded her chest, but just as they reached the bottom of the stairs, the house struck back. With a deafening crack, the ceiling above them caved in, sending chunks of stone and wood crashing down. Tom was thrown forward, landing hard on the floor, while Maggie was flung against the wall, pain radiating through her side as the impact knocked the breath from her lungs. "Maggie?" Tom cried, scrambling to his feet and rushing to her side. "I'm okay," she gasped, wincing as she clutched her ribs. "I'm okay." But as she struggled to stand, her eyes widened in horror. Through the settling dust she saw it, Lillian. The ghostly figure of the little girl stood at the far end of the hallway, her once pale form now flickering violently, as though the energy keeping her tethered to the house was weakening. But despite her fading appearance, Lillian's smile was still there, twisted, malevolent, filled with a hunger that made Maggie's blood run cold. "You can't leave," Lillian whispered, her voice echoing through the shattered hallway. "You belong to me now. To the house. Forever." Maggie's heart raced, but she shook her head, standing shakily with Tom's help. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You can't have us." Lillian's smile widened, her empty eyes narrowing. "We'll see." And then, with a sudden rush of movement, Lillian lunged toward them, her ghostly form streaking through the air like a dark shadow. The temperature plummeted as her cold presence enveloped them, and Maggie felt her body seize with terror. It was as if the very air around them had turned to ice. Tom grabbed Maggie's hand, pulling her toward the stairs. "Go. We have to go now." They stumbled up the stairs, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as Lillian's laughter echoed behind them. The house groaned again, the walls warping, the floor shifting beneath their feet as they raced toward the front of the house. The stairs creaked and splintered beneath their weight, but they kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. As they burst through the basement door and into the main foyer, they found themselves in a scene of utter destruction. The house was tearing itself apart. The ceiling sagged dangerously, and the walls bulged as though something was pressing against them from the inside, trying to break free. But what caught Maggie's attention was the front door. It was wide open. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, the way out was clear. "Tom?" Maggie shouted, pointing to the door. "We can leave." But even as she said it, something dark stirred in the back of her mind. The house wasn't going to let them go that easily. It had given them a glimpse of freedom, but Maggie knew it wasn't finished with them yet. Together, they sprinted toward the door, their feet slipping on the crumbling floor as the house continued to fall apart around them. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, her mind filled with a single thought. "We're almost out. We're almost free." But just as they reached the threshold, the door slammed shut with a thunderous boom. "No!" Maggie screamed, pounding her fists against the door, her breath ragged with panic. She pulled at the handle but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the house had locked it from the inside, trapping them in its twisted, decaying embrace. Tom grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the door. "We need to find another way out." But before they could move, the air around them seemed to shift. The temperature dropped again, and Maggie felt the familiar, chilling presence of Lillian behind her. Slowly she turned, her breath catching in her throat. Lillian stood in the middle of the foyer, her translucent form shimmering in the dim light. But this time she wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures materialized around her, ghostly shapes, twisted and malformed, their faces contorted in silent screams. They were the house's victims, the souls it had consumed over the years, bound to its walls, trapped in its darkness. Their eyes glowed with a cold, haunting light as they surrounded Lillian, their presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You can't leave," Lillian whispered, her voice a low, guttural growl. "You're part of the house now. Just like them." Maggie's chest tightened with fear as she backed away, her eyes darting to the windows, the doors, any way out. But it was hopeless. The house was alive, and it had no intention of letting them escape. Tom grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at one of the windows, shattering the glass. "Come on," he shouted, grabbing Maggie's hand. But before they could reach the broken window, the shadows surged forward, blocking their path. Lillian's ghostly form flickered in front of them, her smile growing wider, more menacing. "You can't win," Lillian said, her voice filled with a dark, mocking glee. "The house always wins." Maggie felt the walls closing in, the cold darkness creeping into her mind, threatening to swallow her whole. The whispers were louder now, relentless, screaming in her ears, telling her to give up, to surrender. But deep down, beneath the fear, something in her fought back. "No." Maggie tightened her grip on Tom's hand, her jaw set with determination. "We're not staying," she whispered. "I'm not staying." In a sudden burst of defiance, Maggie reached into her pocket and pulled out the small rusted key she had found earlier in the study, the key she had almost forgotten about in the chaos. She didn't know why, but something deep inside her told her that this key was important, that it was the key to everything. She turned toward the front door, holding the key up in the dim light. "This is how we end it," she said, her voice trembling but strong. Lillian's face twisted in rage, her ghostly form flickering violently. "No, you can't. The house needs you." But Maggie didn't hesitate. She rushed to the door, thrusting the key into the old rusted lock. For a moment nothing happened. The house seemed to hold its breath, the air around them growing still. And then, with a deafening crack, the lock gave way. The door swung open, and a gust of cold night air rushed into the house, sweeping through the foyer like a cleansing wind. The shadows recoiled, Lillian's form flickering and fading as the light from the outside world flooded in. "No," Lillian screamed, her voice high and desperate. "You can't leave. You can't." But it was too late. The house shuddered violently, the walls groaning as cracks spread through the floor and ceiling. The dark presence that had filled the house for so long was breaking, unraveling, as the open door allowed the night to reclaim its hold. The ghostly figures began to dissolve, their twisted forms fading into the light. Maggie and Tom didn't waste a second. They bolted through the open door into the cool night air. The moment they crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on them lifted, and the whispers, those awful, relentless whispers, finally fell silent. Behind them, the house let out one final, thunderous groan as it began to collapse in on itself, the walls crumbling, the roof caving in. The ancient evil that had held it together for so long was gone, and the house could no longer stand without it. Maggie and Tom watched in stunned silence as the once grand Victorian house fell into ruins, consumed by its own darkness. The night was still, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, as if the world itself was sighing in relief. It was over. Maggie let out a shaky breath, her legs trembling as she leaned against Tom. "We made it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're free." Tom wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "We're free," he echoed, his voice filled with both disbelief and relief. They stood there for a long time, watching the last remnants of the house crumble into the earth. The dark presence was gone, the evil vanquished, but Maggie knew the memory of what had happened would stay with them forever. As they turned to leave, the faintest sound carried on the wind, a soft, childlike giggle, barely audible but unmistakable. Maggie stopped, her heart skipping a beat. But when she looked back at the ruins, there was nothing. Only silence. And the night.